The moment Helena Hawthorne pressed her palm against the cold stone wall of the Varcolac court's lower corridor, she knew she was no longer alone. The sealed chamber door stood 30 feet ahead of her, bound by iron chains as thick as her wrist, stamped with 7 wax crests she recognized from her research files as the marks of the High Vampire Council. Beyond that door, according to every record she had pulled from the city's buried archive system, was a man who had been locked away 6 nights ago without trial, without formal charge read aloud, and without a single word printed in any human newspaper. A man who happened to be a vampire prince. A man whose name had appeared on 3 separate murder cases she had been quietly, obsessively working for the past 4 months. A man named Rasmus Varcolac. Helena had not come here because the Metropolitan Supernatural Division had assigned her this case. She had come here because they had pulled her off it. That distinction she had learned over a decade of detective work made all the difference in the world. The corridor beneath the old Aldermere building in central London was not supposed to exist. According to every city blueprint filed since 1887, this level was solid bedrock. Yet here Helena stood, having followed a sequence of architectural inconsistencies so subtle that any analyst without her particular obsession for spatial logic would have dismissed them as settling cracks or aging masonry. She had noticed that the ventilation shafts on the 4th floor were 6 inches too deep. She had noticed that the electrical conduits on the basement level ran at an angle that served no existing room. She had noticed that the maintenance elevator stopped 2 floors above where the shaft physically ended. And she had noticed, most critically, that the property tax records listed a sub-basement designated only as storage, sealed permanently since 1962, with no decommissioned paperwork ever filed. Someone had hidden an entire level of this building beneath the official record. She moved carefully along the wall, her flashlight held low, her service weapon holstered but unsnapped. The air down here was cold in the particular way that the old vampire courts always were, not the cold of neglect or dampness, but something drier, older, more deliberate, a cold that felt like a choice. She found the hidden door not by luck, but by logic. The sealed chamber door at the end of the corridor, with all its theatrical chains and council wax seals, was a performance. It was meant to be found, meant to be seen, meant to communicate authority and finality. But Helena had learned that when powerful people wanted to make something look permanent, they always put the real mechanism somewhere else. She ran her fingers along the left wall, counting her steps, comparing them to the measurements she had memorized from the blueprint discrepancies. She found the seam at exactly the point she expected it. A hairline crack in the stone, too straight to be natural, running from floor height to just above her shoulder. She found the release mechanism behind a false iron bracket, a simple lever disguised as a wall mounting, and when she pulled it, the hidden door swung inward with a breath of air that smelled of cold stone and something older than dust. Beyond it was a second corridor, narrower, lit by a single line of emergency LED strips running along the floor, the kind of modern electrical work that someone had retrofitted into ancient stonework. And at the end of that narrow corridor, sitting with his back against the far wall and his wrists bound in silver-threaded restraints, was Rasmus Varcolac. She had seen photographs of him, surveillance images, society pages from the vampire community's semi-public publications. One very old oil portrait she had found in a Sotheby's catalogue from 1923. Nothing had adequately prepared her for the reality of him. He was tall, even-seated, with the long-limbed, composed stillness that the oldest vampires carried like armor. His skin was the white of fresh snow, not pallid or sickly but luminous, as if lit from within by something cold and permanent. His hair was white as well, not the white of age but a deep pure white that felled his jaw in sharp lines, pushed back from a face that was angular and severe and quietly devastating. His eyes, when they opened, were the color of old amber lit from behind, dark gold shading to deep brown at the edges, and they fixed on Helena with an attention so complete and immediate that she nearly stepped backward. He did not look surprised. He looked as though he had been waiting. "Detective Hawthorne," he said, and his voice was low and precise, carrying the faint layered accent of someone who had spoken many languages across many centuries. "You are either very brave or very poorly informed." Helena stepped fully into the corridor and let the hidden door close behind her. "I have been told both things with roughly equal frequency," she said. "Are you injured?" Something shifted in his expression, something small and barely controlled. "You came to ask about my welfare." "I came because 3 people are dead and someone in your court is framing you for it," she said. "But welfare seems like a reasonable place to start, given that you are currently bound in silver in a hidden corridor." "So, are you injured?" He regarded her for a long, measuring moment. The silver restraints were clearly causing him pain. She could see it in the careful stillness of his hands, the way he held his wrists at a particular angle to minimize contact, but he was not showing it. She understood instinctively that showing it was simply not something he was built to do. "The silver restraints are uncomfortable," he said finally, which she suspected was the single most diplomatic understatement she had ever heard. "They are not at present life-threatening. The blood law invoked to imprison me requires that my life be preserved until formal tribunal. Whatever else the court is willing to do, they will not kill me without the ritual." He paused. "Not tonight." "What blood law did they invoke?" she asked, pulling out her notebook with the automatic reflex of a decade spent in evidence-gathering. "The law of the sealed prince," he said. "Article 9 of the Old Court Charter, which permits the temporary isolation of a ruling bloodline member when 3 members of the High Council present unified testimony of witnessed crime. The key word being temporary. I have 6 days before the tribunal convenes. After that, the outcome becomes considerably less predictable." Helena sat down cross-legged on the stone floor, which seemed to genuinely surprise him. He looked at her as though he had expected her to remain standing, to keep some formal detective distance. She had found, over many years, that sitting at a person's level during an interrogation changed everything about what they were willing to tell you. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me what actually happened." He was silent for a moment, and she watched him make a decision. She could see it happening behind those amber eyes, the calculation of trust, the ancient pride weighing itself against the present necessity. The 3 individuals who were killed were all members of a faction within the court called the Dusk Covenant, he said. They are not widely known outside vampire society, but within it they represent a significant political force that opposes integration with human governance structures. They have spent the last 40 years working to collapse the agreements that keep vampire courts functioning in legal parallel with human city authorities. The Vampire-Human Compact of 1978, Helena said. His expression shifted in a way that was, she realized, as close to surprise as he was comfortable showing. "You know of it. I have spent 4 months on 3 death cases that all lead to the same court," she said. "Yes, I know about the compact. I know it gives your court legal jurisdiction over vampire civil matters in exchange for compliance with human law on cross-species crimes. I know it is currently under renegotiation. And I know that if the Dusk Covenant could prove that a ruling bloodline member committed 3 murders, they could petition for the compact's termination on grounds of treaty breach. She looked at him steadily. Which is why you were framed, not to punish you personally, to burn the compact. Rasmus looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression changed, deepened, became something she did not have a name for immediately. You arrived at that conclusion, he said quietly, in 4 months of unsupported investigation, with no access to court records, and presumably active interference from your own department. My department pulled me off the case 6 weeks ago, she confirmed. Someone in the Metropolitan Supernatural Division is either working for the Dusk Covenant or has been pressured into covering for them, which means I have been working this off-book since November. Why? He asked. The question was not suspicious. It was genuinely curious, and there was something underneath it that she could not quite read yet. Because 3 people are dead, she said, and because someone is trying to destroy a peace agreement that took 30 years to build, and because I am very bad at being told to stop. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a precision that felt deliberate, the 3 victims were not innocent, Detective Hawthorne. Whatever their faction's politics, they were individually responsible for actions I would not describe to you in detail without considerably more trust established between us. I will tell you that I had reason, personal and court level both, to wish them consequences. I will tell you that I did not kill them, and I will tell you that whoever did has intimate knowledge of my schedule, my movements, and my history with those 3 individuals. Someone in your inner circle, she said, or someone with access to it, he said, which, given current events, amounts to the same problem. She looked at the silver restraints. I can get those off you, she said. I have a silver-breaking compound in my kit, standard issue for supernatural fieldwork. He looked at her hands, then at her face. If you remove those restraints, Detective, the court will argue that you interfered with a lawful detention under blood law. It could compromise any case you build. I was never on this case officially, she said, and you just told me the detention period lasts 6 days. If I leave you in those restraints for 6 days while I build a case externally, the Tribune will convene before I can get the evidence in front of anyone who matters. She held his gaze. So let me be very clear about my options. I can leave you here in silver restraints and attempt to build a case entirely from the outside, with no cooperation from you, no access to court records, and at least 1 hostile operative inside my own division. Or I can get those restraints off, get you out of here through the hidden door that the council apparently does not know I found, and we work this together. The amber eyes were very still. And if I simply walk free without clearing my name, the compact burns anyway. Not if we move fast enough, she said. He studied her for what felt like a very long time. Outside this corridor, the court moved and breathed and plotted, and the clock on his tribunal was already running. She could see him measuring every angle of what she was offering, and she understood that for a vampire of his age and position, accepting from a human detective he had met 3 minutes ago was not a small thing. It was an act of trust that went against every instinct his centuries had built. The hidden door, he said finally. How did you find it? Architectural consistencies, she said. The left wall of the main corridor is 14 inches thicker than the structural load requires. The ventilation routing on this level makes no sense unless there is a secondary passage. The floor-level lighting strips in here are connected to the main building's electrical system, which means someone with building access installed them recently, which means someone wanted this corridor to be usable rather than just sealed. She paused. Also, the wall bracket that hides the release lever had slightly different patination than the surrounding stone. Someone had touched it recently enough to leave a trace oxidation difference. Rasmus Varcolac stared at her. And then, slowly, something happened to his expression that she did not think happened often. The severity softened, not into weakness, but into something genuinely, quietly astonished. "You are remarkable," he said, and the way he said it was entirely unguarded, entirely honest, entirely unlike everything else he had said so far. Helena felt the word land somewhere behind her sternum and tried to treat it professionally. "I am observant," she said briskly. "Now hold still." She moved to him, pulled the compound from her kit, and began the careful process of dissolving the silver threading in the restraints. This close to him, she was acutely aware of everything she had known intellectually about vampires, and was now experiencing in direct physical reality. He was colder than the air. He was entirely still in a way that no living creature with a heartbeat could manage. And he was watching her with that total, unblinking attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in the world. Completely present, completely aware, holding everything around him under constant assessment. "These were applied by someone who knew what they were doing," she said, studying the restraint construction. "The threading pattern is specific to the High Council's enforcement protocols, but the binding points where the threads connect, those are non-standard. Someone modified these." She looked up at him. "They were designed to be more painful than regulation. Someone wanted you suffering, not just contained." His jaw was very tight. "I noticed," he said. "Who hates you specifically as opposed to politically?" she asked. "That is a considerably longer list than I would prefer to admit. Narrow it to anyone with council-level access who has also had personal conflict with you in the last decade," she said. He was quiet while she worked, and she could feel him thinking. "Lord Corvinus Sabo," he said finally. "He sits on the High Council's Eastern faction. We had a significant dispute 7 years ago over territorial boundaries in the Carpathian courts. It was resolved formally, but not, I believe, emotionally." "Zabo," she repeated, writing the name. "Anyone else?" "Lady Ms. Dorath. She was passed over for a court position that I was given by my father's appointment. She has considerable technical knowledge of restraint protocols from her time as a council enforcement officer." "2 names with means," Helena said. "Now tell me which of them has a connection to the Dusk Covenant." His expression shifted. "Both," he said quietly, "which I did not realize until this moment was significant." The final threading dissolved, and the restraints fell away. He was very still for a moment, and she watched color return to his wrists in small, careful degrees, the tissue repairing at a rate that was still slower than she knew it should be. The silver had done real damage, and he had been sitting with it for 6 days. She reached into her kit again and produced a sealed medical flask. She held it out to him. "It is not fresh," she said, matter-of-factly, "but it is clean human blood, preserved properly. Standard kit for supernatural field operations. You need to be at full capacity if we are doing this." He looked at the flask and then at her, and his expression was something she found genuinely difficult to pass. It was pride and necessity meeting each other at close quarters. "You came prepared for this specific situation," he said. I came prepared for the person I believed I would find down here, she said. Take it. I need you functional, not performing resilience for my benefit. He took the flask. He opened it with careful precision and drank, and she looked away, not because it disturbed her, but because she understood instinctively that this was a moment of genuine vulnerability for him, necessity overriding dignity, and he deserved the privacy of it. You looked away, he said, when he was finished. You are allowed to be private, she said simply. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. It was warmer, somehow, in that cold stone corridor. She stood up, repacked her kit, and when she turned back to him, he was standing, and the difference was immediate and complete. He was not merely tall. He was commanding in a way that had nothing to do with aggression, and everything to do with the kind of authority that settles into a person's bones over centuries of being exactly who they are. He rolled his wrists once, testing the healed tissue, and then he looked at her with those amber eyes that had shifted, she noticed, slightly warmer in tone since he'd fed. Detective Hawthorne, he said, I believe we have approximately 5 days and 20 hours before my tribunal convenes. Given that, where do we begin? We begin with the first victim's apartment, she said. I have never had full access to it because the Supernatural Division locked it as a court jurisdiction site. But if you are walking free from court custody, you can formally invoke prince-level authority to grant me joint access. Can you do that? The blood law of the sealed prince, he said, technically suspends my authority during confinement. However, since I am no longer confined, and since the confinement was arguably imposed through fraudulent testimony, I can make a strong argument that my authority was never legitimately suspended. Arguable legally? Arguable enough that anyone who tries to stop you will have to make their case publicly, he said, which is exactly the kind of attention the people behind this do not want. She almost smiled. Good. Then let us go. They moved through the hidden door and back into the main corridor, and she watched him take in the sealed chamber ahead of them, with its theatrical chains and council wax, and she saw something complicated move through his expression. 6 days in silver restraints, in a hidden room, while the political machinery above him worked to destroy everything he had spent decades building. She wanted to ask him what that had been like, and she did not, because she knew it was not the moment, and also because she suspected he would not tell her yet. Outside, the Aldermere building rose above them against a November London sky that was the color of old pewter, and the city moved around them with its ordinary morning indifference, taxis and coffee cups and phone screens, entirely unaware that a vampire prince had just been freed from an illegal hidden confinement by a human detective working off-book on a case she had been ordered to abandon. Rasmus stood on the pavement and breathed the outside air with an expression that he controlled perfectly. And yet, Helena, who was already learning the very slight language of his face, caught the single exhaled breath that was not controlled and filed it away in the part of her that was not operating as a detective. She had parked 2 streets away, a dark saloon car with diplomatic plates that technically belonged to the Supernatural Division, and that she was currently borrowing without permission. She led him to it without explaining and got in, and after a single moment of consideration, he folded himself into the passenger seat with the particular grace of someone who had spent centuries adjusting to whatever space the world offered him. "Do you drive?" she asked. "I have not needed to in some years," he said. "The court provides vehicles." "Right," she said. Did any of them know where I lived before this morning?" He looked at her. "You believe your residence may be compromised. I believe that someone inside my division is connected to the people who framed you, and that your disappearance from that corridor is going to be discovered within hours. Yes, I believe my residence may be compromised." She pulled out of the parking space and into traffic. "I have a secondary location. An evidence safe house I set up 6 weeks ago when the division pulled me off the case, because I do not leave things to chance. You set up a safe house 6 weeks ago," he said slowly. "In anticipation of this exact scenario. Not exactly this scenario," she said. "I anticipated needing somewhere to work from that. Was not accessible to whoever had compromised the division. I did not anticipate the Vampire Prince himself being part of it. But the principle holds." He was watching her drive with the same total attention he had given everything else, and she was aware of it in a way she was trying to be professional about. "You have been working this case for 4 months alone, without official support against active internal resistance," he said. "Why does that level of dedication exist in a person, detective?" She kept her eyes on the road. "I told you, 3 people are dead, and someone is trying to burn down a peace agreement. Those are reasons why a good detective works a difficult case," he said. "They are not reasons why a detective works it for 4 months after being removed from it and continues working it at personal professional risk." A pause. "There is something else." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother was human. My father was half Fae, which is not something I broadcast professionally. I grew up knowing that the distance between the human world and the supernatural world is not philosophical. It is personal. People on both sides of that line lose things when the agreements between them break down." She glanced at him briefly. "The compact is not abstract to me, and neither are the 3 people who died because someone wanted to destroy it." Rasmus was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be meaningful. "The half-Fae parentage," he said carefully. "Does that give you any supernatural sensitivity? Anything that might be relevant to our situation?" "Nothing useful for combat or magic," she said. "But my pattern recognition is somewhat beyond normal human baseline, and I do not forget anything. I have seen or read. Eidetic memory, according to the one specialist who tested it." "That is how you held all the blueprint measurements in your head," he said. "Yes. And how you noticed the oxidation difference on the bracket." "Yes." He was quiet again, and this time she thought it was something like wonder carefully contained. "Your half-Fae heritage," he said, "combined with a decade of detective training. You are, Detective Hawthorne, genuinely the most dangerous investigative mind I have encountered in 3 centuries." She told herself firmly that the warmth she felt at this was entirely professional satisfaction and nothing else. The safe house was a rented flat in Bethnal Green, registered under a name Helena had used exactly twice before in undercover work, paid in cash through a solicitor who asked no questions. It was a 3rd-floor walk-up above a print shop, and it smelled of old paper and tea, and when she pushed the door open, it revealed 4 walls covered in exactly the kind of investigation board that her divisional supervisor had once described as evidence of an unhealthy relationship with unsolved cases. Rasmus stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and looked at the walls. 3 victims, 6 weeks of solo fieldwork. Photographs, timelines, court connection maps, financial records she had obtained through channels that were technically legal if interpreted generously. Thread lines in 3 colors connecting dates and names and locations. A central cluster around the Varcolac court that she had mapped from public record and inference alone. She watched him take it all in, and she watched his expression move through something that was complex and difficult. For him, she could see the effort of it in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. "You built this alone," he said. "4 months," she confirmed. "You believed I was innocent before you ever came to find me," he said. It was not quite a question. "The evidence as assembled points away from you in 4 separate directional patterns," she said. "You are too specifically implicated in all 3 scenes to have done this carelessly, and carelessly is the only way you would have done it, because you are intelligent enough that if you had intended to kill 3 people, you would not have left a single thread pointing to yourself, let alone the particular pattern that was left. The implication was too clean, too deliberate." She paused. "Also, your timeline had you in a court session until 2 in the morning on the night of the 2nd murder, and I have 17 witnesses. No one in the division bothered to check them." Rasmus turned from the wall and looked at her directly, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. Something open, something that was not protected by centuries of aristocratic composure. Something that looked, she thought, very much like gratitude, meeting something deeper than gratitude, something that did not yet have a name. 17 witnesses, he said quietly. "And no one checked them. The division wanted the case closed," she said. "Someone made sure of it." "The operative inside your division," he said. "Who is it?" "I believe it is Detective Chief Inspector Marlowe," she said. "He pulled me off the case personally. Destroyed 2 evidence requests I had filed, and I have a partial financial record showing payments from a shell company that traces, eventually, to a property holding linked to Corvinus Szabó." His expression went very still. "You have Szabó's financial connection." "Partial," she said. "Not enough for a court filing on its own, but combined with the right witness testimony and access to court, records that I cannot officially obtain without your authority, it should be enough." He moved to the investigation board, and she watched him trace the thread lines with a focused attention that was different from how he had looked at it a moment ago. Now he was working. She could see it, connecting information she had gathered to context only he possessed, filling in the gaps that her external view could never have reached. "The first victim," he said, touching a photograph. "Adric Morn. He was Szabó's principal intelligence officer for 7 years before publicly breaking with Szabó's faction 2 years ago. What the court does not know, and what I suspect you do not know, is that the breaks was staged. Morn was a deep asset. He moved within 3 separate court factions as a supposed defector and fed information back to Szabó continuously. Helena pulled out her notebook. So Morn knew things about Szabó that Szabó needed suppressed, or Morn had outlived his usefulness and knew enough to be dangerous if he ever genuinely defected, Rasmus said. He touched the second photograph. Petra Lendvai. She was a court archivist. She had access to the original documentation of the compact agreements. She could have verified evidence of tampering, Helena said immediately. Or she had already found it. "The 3rd victim," he said, touching the last photograph. "Basil Tremorne. He was a human solicitor who held the compact documentation on behalf of the human signatories." Helena stood very still. "All 3 victims had direct connection to the compact's documentation chain," she said. Morn knew about Szabó's internal information network. Lendvai had access to the original documents. Tremorne held the human copies. She looked at him. They were removing everyone who could verify whether the original compact terms had been altered. The compact is being renegotiated, Rasmus said, and his voice had gone very quiet and very dangerous. If the original documentation has been interfered with, and if the three people most likely to identify that interference are eliminated, then the renegotiation proceeds on falsified terms. Not just destroying the compact, Helena said, replacing it with something worse. He turned to look at her, and the amber of his eyes had gone very dark. Something that gives the Dusk Covenant effective veto power over cross-species enforcement. They have been working toward this for 20 years. This is not a political maneuver. This is a 30-year plan. Helena sat down heavily at the small kitchen table. Then the tribunal is also a distraction, she said. While everyone is focused on your guilt or innocence, the renegotiation proceeds. The tribunal is scheduled to begin on the same day as the compact's renegotiation signing, he said. I noticed that when they read me the schedule, but I did not understand the significance until this moment. They stared at each other across the small flat, the investigation board behind him, and the London morning outside the frosted window, and the full shape of it was terrible and very clear. We have 5 days, she said. Yes, he said. Then sit down, she said, and tell me everything you know about Chabot's court access. Dorothy's record as an enforcement officer, and whoever within your own inner circle had enough information about your schedule and history to construct this frame. He sat down across from her, and he talked, and she wrote, and the morning moved into afternoon in the Bethnal Green flat, while the city outside went about its oblivious business, and the two of them built the architecture of something that was, jointly, sharper and more complete than either of them could have built alone. It was in the afternoon when she got up to make tea without asking, and simply set a cup in front of him, that she noticed something she had not registered consciously before. She was comfortable with him, not professionally comfortable, not the managed rapport of an interview, but genuinely, instinctively comfortable, as though some part of her that was usually on guard had made a decision without consulting her rational mind. She filed this observation carefully and moved on. He noticed the tea. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize as him being genuinely touched by something small. You made tea, he said. You have been in silver restraints for 6 days and talking for 4 hours, she said. Even vampires run on something other than pure dignity. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and it transformed his face briefly into something that was, she thought with strict professional detachment, genuinely beautiful. You have a remarkable way, he said carefully, of making practicality feel like kindness. They are often the same thing, she said, and sat back down. By evening, they had a preliminary case structure that was solid enough to take to a sympathetic human magistrate, or, ideally, to the compact's human co-signatories, who had their own investigative authority under Article 14 of the original agreement. The problem was reaching either without alerting Chabot's network or Marlowe's operation inside the division. There is one person, Helena said, who sits on the compact's Joint Oversight Committee and who has reason to be personally opposed to Chabot's faction. She is human. She is a retired Court of Appeal judge, and she was one of the original human negotiators in 1978. Her name is Justice Calloway. If I can get her the documentation package we are building, she has the authority to freeze the renegotiation signing pending independent review. If she is reachable, Rasmus said. She lives in Clerkenwell, Helena said. I met her twice during my early career. She knows who I am, and she is, I believe, someone who cannot be pressured. She is 83 years old, and she has lived through things that make the Dusk Covenant look like a minor inconvenience. She paused. The problem is getting to her without the division tracking my movement. I can move unseen in ways that you cannot, Rasmus said. It was not arrogance. It was simply accurate. If you give me the documentation package, I can be in Clerkenwell and back within 2 hours. You are officially an escaped prisoner under blood law, she said. If you are seen in the city, the court sends enforcement. If I am not seen, he said, that is not a problem. She thought about this for a moment. No, she said, not because I do not trust your ability to move unseen, because the package needs context, and context needs me. Justice Calloway will trust this more if I am there to present it. He looked at her steadily. Then we go together. Together means you expose yourself to potential enforcement contact. Together means you are not alone with a hostile division at your back and no supernatural support, he said, and the way he said it was very quiet and very absolute. The tone of someone for whom this was not negotiable and also not aggressive. Simply the only possible position he was prepared to occupy. She felt that land differently than she expected. I have been handling hostile situations without supernatural support for 10 years, she said. Yes, he said, and you no longer have to. The silence in the flat was very warm. All right, she said after a moment, together. But we go after dark, and you stay back unless I signal. Define the signal, he said. If I put my left hand in my coat pocket, she said, something has gone wrong, and I need you to do whatever vampires do when they decide something has gone wrong. He almost smiled again. That is an admirably concise briefing. I am a concise person, she said. They left at 9 in the evening. When the November dark was fully established and the Clerkenwell streets ran wet with light scattered rain, he moved beside her on the pavement, and she was aware of the way people's eyes did not quite track him the way they should have. A subtle deflection of attention that she understood was intentional and supernatural and deeply useful. To passing strangers, they were simply two people walking. To anyone watching specifically for either of them, she imagined they looked precisely like a woman in a dark coat carrying a document case and a vampire prince who was theoretically locked in a hidden basement corridor. Justice Calloway opened her own door, as Helena had expected she would, and looked at Helena for a long moment, with the particular sharpness of someone who had spent decades reading the truth behind whatever was presented to her. Detective Hawthorne, she said. I wondered when someone sensible would show up. She looked past Helena at Rasmus. Her expression did not change, but something in it acknowledged and assessed him in a single, efficient sweep. And Prince Varcolac, she said. The court believes you are sealed in the lower chamber. The court is mistaken, Rasmus said, with a composure that Helena found honestly impressive. Evidently, said Justice Calloway. Come in then, both of you. I have whiskey for the detective, and I imagine the prince has his own arrangements. Sit down and tell me what you have, and do it quickly, because I suspect we are working against a clock. They were inside for 90 minutes. Helena laid out the complete case structure, the financial connections, the victim relationship to the compact documentation chain, the insider connection to DCI Marlowe, the dual suspect analysis of Chabot and Dorath. Calloway listened without interrupting, her eyes moving between Helena and the documents with an efficiency that was still formidable at 83. Rasmus provided court-level context at precise moments. filling in the internal vampire politics with a precision and a willingness to be candid about his own court's vulnerabilities that Helena suspected cost him more than he was showing. When they finished, Calloway was quiet for a long moment. "Article 14, she said finally. "I can invoke it by tomorrow morning. It freezes the renegotiation signing for 30 days pending independent review. But the documentation you have is strong enough to support a criminal referral as well. That is what I intend to file." "The tribunal," Rasmus said. "It convenes in 5 days. The Blood Law Tribunal falls under court jurisdiction," Calloway said. "I cannot override it directly. But if I have a parallel proceeding underway in human jurisdiction, and if the evidence implicating Chabot and Dorath in the murders is formally filed, then the court is obligated under the Compact's Article 7 to delay any blood law tribunal until the cross-species proceeding reaches a finding." She looked at him steadily. "You are aware of Article 7, I am," he said. "I was hoping you would be as well." "I wrote Article 7, she said, and there was something in her voice that was dry and satisfied and entirely wonderful. "Go home, Prince Varcolac, not to the court. Somewhere safe. Give me until morning." Outside, in the rain-wet Clerkenwell Street, Helena and Rasmus stood for a moment, not quite moving. The relief of it was something she was trying to manage professionally and not entirely succeeding at. "She wrote Article 7, Helena said. "She is," Rasmus said, "a remarkable person." "She is," Helena agreed. She looked up at him. In the streetlight, with the rain still falling lightly and the city moving around them, he was something that she was finding increasingly difficult to observe with full professional detachment. The white of his hair in the amber light, the way he stood with that absolute composure that was not coldness but something more like a deep, settled certainty in himself. The way he had spoken to Calloway, not with the deflection or performance she might have expected from someone fighting for their freedom, but with a directness and an honesty that had clearly come from the decision, made in a safe house in Bethnal Green, to trust the process she had built, to trust her. "You should not go back to the court yet," she said. "Not until Calloway files in the morning." "I know," he said. "The safe house? If you are comfortable with it," she said, and was aware that the question meant something slightly different than it had that morning. "I am comfortable," he said, and that also meant something slightly different. They went back through the rain-dark streets of London, side by side, and there was something that had settled between them that was warmer and more complicated than the professional alliance they had started with. She was aware of it the way she was aware of most things, clearly and completely, and with an honesty she applied to her own inner life, the same way she applied it to evidence boards. She was falling for him. She had been falling for him, she suspected, since he had said, "You are remarkable," in that underground corridor, with the total unguardedness of someone whose defenses had been stripped away and who had not bothered to rebuild them in that moment. She had filed it away and continued working, because that was what she did with things that were true and complicated and not immediately actionable. Back in the safe house, with the city quiet outside and the investigation board still covering the walls, she made more tea, and he stood looking at the board with an expression that was something private and something she did not quite have language for yet. "What happens to you?" she said carefully. "If Calloway's filing does not stop the tribunal." He turned from the board. He looked at with a directness that she recognized now as his primary mode when he was being entirely honest. "If the tribunal proceeds without the compact protection," he said, "and if the council majority votes against me, The blood law permits permanent exile from the court line. In practical terms, that means expulsion from the Varcolac bloodline's political inheritance, loss of court standing, and formal separation from the community I have been responsible for since my father's death. Not your death, she said, making sure. Not my death, he confirmed. The blood law of the sealed prince, even in its harshest form, does not prescribe death for the ruling line. But exile is its own kind of death for someone whose entire existence has been built in service of his court and his people. She looked at him, and the thing she felt was clean and clear and not professional at all. I will not let that happen, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Helena, he said. And it was the first time he had used her given name. And he said it as though it was something he had been considering the weight of for a while. You have worked for 4 months unsupported on a case that directly costs you to protect an agreement you believe in and to defend the life of a man you had never met. You broke into a court-sealed facility. You freed me from illegal confinement. You sat on a stone floor and asked about my welfare. You made me tea, he paused. You made me tea twice. She could feel the warmth in her face and decided to be honest about it. I notice things about people, she said. It is difficult to notice things about you and not want to take care of them. You are the most singular person, he said quietly, that I have encountered in a very, very long time. She stood up and crossed the small flat to where he stood, and she looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The investigation board covered the walls behind him. 4 months of her work and the lives of 3 dead people, and the skeleton of a 30-year peace that was still in danger. And all of it was real and all of it mattered. But so did this. So did the way he was looking at her, with those amber eyes that were entirely warm, with a tenderness that seemed to surprise him every time it emerged. I should tell you something, he said, before anything else changes between us, because I think things are changing between us, and I would not have them change on a false foundation. Tell me, she said. When the Dusk Covenant began their campaign against me, he said, they used, among other tactics, an argument about blood law miscegenation, the old prohibition against intimate bonds between vampire royalty and non-vampire individuals. It is not a law that has been formally enforced in 200 years, but it is still technically on the court charter. If I am with you in any way that becomes known, it is something they will use. She held his gaze. Is it something you are concerned about for yourself? Or are you telling me because you think I should know what I would be walking into? The latter, he said immediately. I gave up caring about my personal political cost sometime around the 2nd day of silver restraints. She smiled at that, fully, for the first time since they had met, and she watched him absorb the sight of it with an expression that was completely unguarded and deeply, quietly delighted. Then we face it, she said, together, like Clerkenwell. Like Clerkenwell, he agreed. He reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, a touch so careful and deliberate that it was its own kind of declaration, and she turned her face slightly into it, and the warmth between them was enormous and real and exactly right. After this is finished, he said, and it will be finished, because you are involved and you do not leave things unresolved. I would like to take you somewhere that is not a safe house or a hidden corridor. Somewhere with windows, she said. Many windows, he confirmed, and no silver restraints. That is an extremely low bar for a romantic proposition, she said. And he laughed, and it was a real laugh, unexpected and warm and briefly very young, and she filed it away in the part of her that kept all the things that mattered, The morning came grey and cold, and at 7:43, her phone received a notification from the Joint Oversight Committee's digital system. Justice Calloway had filed under Article 14 at 6 in the morning. The renegotiation signing was frozen pending independent review. The criminal referral naming Corvinus Chabot and Ms. Doroth as suspects in 3 homicides and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud a binding supernatural agreement had been formally lodged with both human and vampire judicial systems simultaneously, invoking Article 7 of the Compact. The tribunal was automatically delayed. Helena read the notification twice and then set the phone down and looked at Rasmus, who was standing in the morning light from the kitchen window and who had been awake the entire night because he did not sleep, and who had spent much of that time, she realized, simply being present in the same space as her while she slept on the safe-house couch, a fact she found both slightly unsettling and deeply, quietly comforting. "It is done," she said. "Article 7 is invoked," he said. He had been reading the same notification on his own phone. The tribunal cannot proceed until the cross-species proceeding reaches a finding. Given the evidence Calloway has, that finding should not take more than 2 weeks. He paused.
"They will run, you know, Chabot and Doroth, when they realize the filing is in."
"I know," she said, "which is why I sent 1 additional document last night while you were being still and quiet and pretending not to watch me sleep." He looked at her. "I sent the financial connection between Chabot and DCI Marlowe to the Independent Police Conduct Authority with a copy to the Court of Appeal," she said. "Marlowe's accounts were frozen at 6 this morning as well. Without Marlowe to coordinate their response and without their financial network accessible, Chabot and Doroth cannot run effectively. They do not have the infrastructure." He stared at her for a long moment. "You sent that last night." "I sent it at 2 in the morning while you were being very still and quiet," she confirmed. He crossed the small kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in both hands. And she looked up at him, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Something fierce and warm and privately enormous. "You extraordinary woman," he said, and kissed her, and it was warm and careful and very certain. The kiss of someone who had been measuring the weight of the decision and had decided with complete conviction. She kissed him back with equal certainty, and the grey November morning outside was entirely uninterested in all of it, which suited her completely. Chabot was taken by joint court and human authority enforcement at his London residence 3 days later. Doroth was detained at Heathrow, attempting to board a flight under a false identity that Calloway's investigative team had anticipated. Marlowe resigned from the Metropolitan Supernatural Division before formal charges were filed, which Helena's supervisor communicated to her in a phone call that also somewhat chaotically included an offer to reinstate her at 1 grade above her previous rank. She told him she would think about it, which was detective language for no, not under those structural conditions. But she would be open to renegotiation. The tribunal, when it finally convened under proper Article 7 conditions, lasted 4 hours. The independent review of the evidence Helena had built, combined with court records that Rasmus was able to formally introduce now that his prince-level authority had been legally restored, produced what the officiating council members described as the most thoroughly documented exoneration in court history. Corvinus Chabot's fraudulent testimony was formally struck from the record. The council wax seals on the hidden corridor were declared void. The sealed Prince Bloodlaw was, in a separate proceeding that Calloway also supported, formally amended to require human judicial oversight in any future invocation. Helena sat in the back of the tribunal chamber, which was an enormous vaulted room beneath a building she had suspected existed but never entered. All dark stone and cold candlelight and vampire aristocracy in formal court dress that made her feel slightly underdressed in her grey wool suit. Rasmus stood at the front of the chamber, straight-backed and entirely composed, white-haired and amber-eyed, and everything that he was without apology, while the council read its findings. She watched him and thought about 4 months alone in a safe house in Bethnal Green, and a stone floor in a hidden corridor, and tea made twice in a small kitchen, and a kiss in the grey morning light. And she thought about how the most significant things in a life were so rarely the things you could have anticipated. When the tribunal concluded and the chamber began to empty, he found her at the back, moving through the dispersing crowd with the direct efficiency of someone who had one specific destination. He stopped in front of her, and the formal court atmosphere around them was full of other vampires and their careful attention, and he looked at her with no performance and no management at all. "It is finished," he said. "It is finished," she agreed. "You are owed," he said, "a considerable number of things, a proper introduction which we somewhat skipped, a meal that is not eaten on a safe house kitchen table, a window, several windows, and a conversation about the future that I would like to have with you when you are not in an underground tribunal chamber. I have the rest of the day free," she said. "I am currently unemployed, technically, pending renegotiation of my contract with the division." The corner of his mouth moved in the way that she had memorized. "Come with me," he said. She went with him. The Varcolac estate was not what she had expected, which was to say, it was exactly as extraordinary as she should have expected, and she had still not adequately prepared herself. It occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Mayfair that appeared from the outside to be a conventional Georgian townhouse, and was from the inside something that had been accumulating centuries of beauty with patient deliberateness. There were windows everywhere, tall, south-facing, curtained in layers that could manage daylight without eliminating it. There were books on every wall, and maps, and paintings that were not reproductions. There was a fire in a room that had clearly been set before they arrived, which meant the court staff had been notified, which meant he had arranged this. She stood in the main sitting room and turned slowly, taking it in, and when she turned back to him, he was watching her with an expression that was openly happy in a way that she thought was not something he wore, often something private and large and without armor. "It is beautiful," she said. "I have not brought anyone here in a very long time," he said. "I find I wanted you to see it." She crossed to the window that looked out over the Mayfair street. The grey afternoon London, the ordinary world going about itself with complete indifference to vampire courts and compact politics, and the extraordinary week she had just lived through. She felt him come to stand beside her. "The staff," he said carefully, "are aware that you may come and go as you choose. That was also not something I have told them about anyone in a very long time." She looked at him. "You are telling me I am welcome here." "I am telling you," he said, "that wherever I am, you are welcome there, whether that is here or the court chambers or another underground corridor that needs your architectural analysis." He paused. "I am telling you that I am somewhat remarkably in love with you." Wanted to say that plainly, rather than around the edges of it. The word landed in her with the weight of something true. "4 days," she said. It has been 4 days. I am 312 years old, he said. I have a considerable capacity for knowing my own mind, and I have spent 300 years meeting people who were intelligent or brave or kind, and very rarely all three, and never all three, in a person who also sat down on a cold stone floor to ask after my welfare and noticed the oxidation difference on a wall bracket. He held her gaze. I know what I feel. I am simply telling you what it is. Helena turned fully toward him. She thought about everything she knew about reading evidence and building cases, and what was true versus what was wanted, and she thought about the way she had known in a Bethnal Green kitchen at 2 a.m. with a vampire prince quietly still across the room, that something in her had already decided. I am also, she said, somewhat remarkably, in love with you. I have been working very hard to process it professionally, and I am not entirely sure that was the right strategy. He took her hand and held it and looked at her with everything he was. The centuries and the court and the ancient pride and the white hair and the amber eyes and the man beneath all of it, who had said you are remarkable in a cold corridor with silver on his wrists. And she looked back with everything she was, the detective and the half-fey daughter and the woman who did not stop when she was told to, and who noticed things other people missed, and who had made tea twice in a safe-house kitchen because she cared and could not show it. No more professional processing, he said gently. Agreed, she said, and leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her with the absolute certainty of someone who had decided something and would not be moved from it. And she felt the cold and the stillness and the permanence of him, and it was not frightening. It was the most safe she had felt in as long as she could remember. The fire burned in the grate behind them, and the London afternoon moved past the tall Georgian windows, and the compact renegotiation proceeded under Calloway's independent oversight, and Sabo and Dorath faced proceedings in 2 parallel justice systems that would occupy their next several years at minimum, and DCI Marlowe's financial irregularities unraveled in the public record with the methodical inevitability of exposed corruption, and the Metropolitan Supernatural Division's new superintendent reached out to Helena with a contract offer that was, this time, structured the way she had asked. She read it one evening at the Varcolac estate, sitting by the tall south window with tea that Rasmus had made himself, badly, which she had found entirely endearing. And she read the contract and thought about what she wanted the next chapter of her life to look like, and found that she knew exactly. She would take the contract. She would build the joint supernatural human investigation unit that she had proposed in the margin notes of the renegotiated offer. She would have the eidetic memory and the 4 months of off-book expertise and the experience of having cracked the most politically significant supernatural case in London in 30 years. And she would have, in whatever capacity they built between them, the intimate knowledge of the vampire court that came with knowing Rasmus Varcolac, who was 312 years old and deeply certain of his own mind and entirely, genuinely hers. She looked up from the contract to find him watching her from across the room, and the amber eyes were warm, and she thought about sitting on a cold stone floor and asking about his welfare and not quite understanding yet what she was beginning. I am taking the job, she said. I know, he said. I could tell from the way you read the 3rd page. You can tell how I am going to decide something from watching me read? I can tell a great number of things from watching you, he said, crossing the room to her. You have very expressive patterns for someone who believes they are internally contained, she laughed. That is profoundly unfair. Entirely accurate, he said, and sat beside her, and she leaned into him with the ease of something that had already become natural, already become theirs. Outside, London moved in its grey and ordinary way, full of people who had no idea that underneath their streets was a world of courts and blood laws and ancient covenants and the political machinery of immortal families, and that somewhere inside that world was a hidden door that a human detective had found because she noticed what other people did not notice and would not stop when she was told to. The compact renegotiation was completed under Justice Calloway's oversight 4 weeks later, with strengthened protections, cleaner cross-species enforcement language, and a new clause proposed by Rasmus and drafted with Helena's precise legal language, establishing a permanent joint investigative authority with equal human and vampire membership. It was ratified by both the Vampire High Council and the human ceremony that took place in a room Helena had never been in before, surrounded by people she was only beginning to learn the names of. And Rasmus stood beside her the entire time, which was noted and observed by everyone present and commented on by several, and he was entirely unbothered by the commentary, which she thought was one of the things she loved most about him. The blood law miscegenation prohibition was challenged in court 2 months after that, partly because Sabo's faction, in its desperate final political maneuvering, attempted to invoke it as a weapon. The challenge failed, largely because Calloway's team had spent those 2 months preparing an argument that dismantled the prohibition's legal basis with a thoroughness that Helena recognized as her own analytical style, applied by someone who had been in this business since 1978 and was not remotely tired of winning. That evening, when Helena came home from the proceedings, which she had followed from the public gallery, with her notebook and her careful eyes, Rasmus was waiting for her in the main room with the fire lit, and something that smelled like a proper dinner being prepared by the court chef, who had taken it upon himself to become extremely interested in Helena's nutritional welfare. "The prohibition is struck down," she said. "I heard," he said. Calloway left the courtroom looking extremely satisfied. "She wrote the challenge brief herself," he said. "She told me it was the most fun she had had in a decade." Helena set down her bag and her coat and looked at him. "What happens now?" she asked. He crossed the room to her. He was, as always, entirely composed and entirely certain. The 300 years of him, and the amber eyes, and the white hair, and the way he held himself, like something permanent and unshakable. And he was also the person who had looked at her in an underground corridor, with something unguarded in his face, and had said, "You are remarkable," without any performance at all. "Now," he said, "we build whatever we decide to build, with no prohibition, with no political obstacle, with no hidden door to find and no sealed chamber to break someone out of." He paused. "Unless you find another set of architectural inconsistency, I will always find the architectural inconsistencies," she said. "I know," he said. I find that entirely perfect." She stepped forward and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the certainty she had come to know as simply how he was with her, entirely and without reservation, and the fire was warm behind them, and the London evening was settling into full dark outside the tall windows, and the world was, for all its court politics and blood laws and ancient complications, genuinely and fully good. There was one more thing she had been carrying for a while, and she said it now, because she had decided that. Being with him meant saying the true things when they were true rather than processing them into professional stillness. I spent 4 months in a room alone, building a case for a man I had never met, she said, and I think some part of me knew even then that it was going to change my life. I do not entirely understand how that works, but I know it is true. He was very still and very warm. The part of you that notices things, he said. Even before you have reasons. Yes, she said. That part, he said, holding her face in both hands and looking at her with everything, with the 3 centuries and the court and the love that he had said plainly and without armor, has excellent judgment. She smiled fully, the way she had smiled that morning in the safe house kitchen when he had almost smiled back. The beginning of something that had become this, and outside the Georgian windows of the Varcolac estate the city went on in its ordinary and extraordinary way, and inside them the fire burned, and the world was full and complete and exactly right. She stayed. She had always been going to stay.